Hello everyone, welcome to the Blue Flash Station. I'm your Tokusatsu tour guide, XL2K/Shaish on Facebook, and today in my info series I'll be covering the granddaddy of them all, Kamen Rider. I'm going to be talking about its basic premise, when it started, how it's changed over the years, its content, basically all you would need to know, a nice little beginner's guide here, and I'm also going to try and sort out its continuity for you. Bit of a task, but I'm going to do it. And this also works as a nice little information video if you want to pass it along to anybody who wants to know more about Kamen Rider and just want like a quick vid to get a nice little introductory. Also serves as a nice little introductory to cover any concepts or words I may use in any future Kamen Rider oriented things I may cover, specifically Bat-Right War, which I'm thinking of reviewing. And alright, without further ado, let's get this ball rolling. Kamen Rider is a Japanese live-action superhero series that was originally brought to television by Toei in 1971. The series, of course, was simply just called Kamen Rider. Over the years, after its success, several other series were made in what became known as, of course, the Showa era. This era encompasses Kamen Rider, the series itself, all the way straight through to Black RX. This summarizes the Showa series television run. As for the basic premise of what Kamen Rider is, during the Showa era, it would follow a similar formula. More specifically, an individual would be captured by an evil organization of some sort, most of the time shocker, and they would be experimented on and turned into a cyborg, for the sole purpose of making him an evil lieutenant or foot soldier in their quest to conquer the earth. But the person, being inherently the good person that they are, turn on this evil organization and use that power against them to eventually stop them. This premise would continue on through, well, like I said, the Showa era, and it would take on some mild variations, but would stick to the basic evil organization captures heroes, so on and so forth. After that time, Kamen Rider after Black RX was taken off of TV, and they had experimented with a few individual solo films, Kamen Rider ZO, Kamen Rider Shin, Kamen Rider J. These were individual films that didn't really essentially link to the Showa continuity, but existed in their own right. Whether or not they linked to Showa is relatively unknown, but I'll deal with the continuity issues later. Kamen Rider returned to television in the year 2000 and essentially restarted its continuity with a show known as Kamen Rider Kyuga. The clock starts at 0, as it says in the intro, and this was indeed that. The starting premise for the character was changed. No longer was it his powers coming from an evil organization. It was actually an ancient power from an ancient tribe that used to battle this race of evil monsters called Grongi. It would then be followed up by Kamen Rider Akito, and then so on and so forth. This would become known as the Heisei era of Kamen Rider, which generally goes through, depending on your perspective, Kyuga through decade or Kyuga through basically now. Not only did they change starting premises, they also would eventually variate away from the more insect-like designs and themes that they would have from the Showa era, which they would constantly reuse. And slowly but surely, every single writer would take on a different design, a different look, a different aesthetic. They would have different origins, different kinds of powers. They'd fight different types of enemies, and essentially each show would be its own interesting starting point, because for the most part, in the Heisei era up to a certain point, these shows didn't link with one another. They were self-contained universes. Until eventually that was changed later on, which I'll get into the continuity in a bit. So that's the basic premise of what Kamen Rider kind of is, what it's become, and how they've relaunched it, and how they're currently in. We're still in the Heisei run as we speak. So let's move on to the next piece of business. content-wise, while Kamen Rider is generally aimed towards children, in its earlier iterations, it had its scenes of violence, death, character deaths, so on and so forth, tackling other concepts of death and life and all these other different things. Over time, they've kind of softened a little bit, but all those violent premises still tend to be there. Which basically, they added the premises of humor. The designs have become a little bit more extravagant over time and a little bit more eye-popping. But aesthetically, at its core, those darker themes are still there. They're a little bit more muted, but they're still essentially there. And basically, it's not American TV child programming in any sense of the word. Okay, let's get into the continuity of Kamen Rider, which needs some explaining. A lot of explaining. Okay, so essentially, as I stated before, the initial TV series run of Kamen Rider, which started with the original Kamen Rider series and transitioned straight through to Black RX, that was its own continuity. It has its own world, everything linked, it had continuity, all the characters would cross over eventually, and so on and so forth. Then you had the sub-segment era, which I'm just going to dub the movie era, where they had the individual films, two of which mildly linked to each other, but not very strongly. And whether or not these existed in the same Showa world is in crossovers. They've kind of appeared as part of the Showa side, so I guess perhaps they are. Toei has never been 100% clear for that, but for me, I'm just going to classify it as the movie era. These movies were their own little self-contained things. Whether or not they truly linked to Showa is remotely unknown, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Heisei, as I stated before, started with Kyuga and had rolled up straight through. But this was different in a sense that the Heisei continuity is where things get a little complicated. Okay, so Kyuga and Agito existed in the same world, and they were crossed over with each other, but in Agito, they mention all the stuff that happened in Kyuga, most of which in passing. But then after that, when Ryuki had started, they essentially started from a blank slate again, and then they would continue to do such until Kamen Rider Decade, which ran into some problems. The most core essential problem being that they wanted to make a giant series that would bring all the Heisei riders together for the very first time in one big crossover TV show, and it would center around this new character, Kamen Rider Decade, who didn't remember his past or anything like that, but somehow had these cards that enabled him to change into the other riders. So he essentially goes on a quest to find his point of origin, to regain his lost memories, and regain his lost power. He would go from world to world from the Heisei riders and essentially learn something new from them, have his damn epiphany, and then basically get that power back and have something special that he would do specifically with that rider and turn him into some special form for the day. The problem is, like I said, they couldn't get the actors to come back. So instead of making the simple decision, just recast the actors. He'll be the same character, he'll just be a different actor. Toei didn't really want to do that, and they made a decision which I felt was the wrong choice. Was to essentially make parallel universe versions of the previous Heisei writers. These would be not only different actors, they would be different characters entirely, with different backstories and certain facts construed and things changed. And those would be the writers that he would cross over with. Of course, this didn't make the other original Heisei writers non-existent or rebooted. They weren't rebooted in any way, and eventually the original Kamen Rider Blade would return. The actor and all will return near the end of the series, and thus confirming that the original Heisei versions of these writers are still intact. Their worlds are still real. They still exist. Although over time, the decade versions of the Heisei writers would never really appear again. Those actors would never really reprise their roles much at all or ever. the Decade version of Kyuga, which basically followed Decade around everywhere, would never really appear again, the actor, which adds a little bit of confusion because sometimes I have to question which one I see on screen in other crossover films, and I guess for the most part, it is the original Heisei versions, even though they're weaker and somehow forgot half their moves. It's a whole ball of wax that, and part of some grabs I may have. But anyway, after Decade finished, Double was introduced. They had their crossover film. He had his crossover film with Double, and from Double on, they wanted to reintroduce full-blown continuity into the Kamen Rider universe, into the Heisei franchise. And there's a fan classification that some fans use to describe this iteration of the Heisei era, which has come to be known as the Neo Heisei era. So if I ever say this word, Neo Heisei, I essentially mean Double straight on up. And the reason why some of us, and me, have come to call it that is because, again, continuity was reintroduced. So now all these Kamen Riders from Double and up existed in the same exact universe. They weren't from parallel dimensions. They didn't have to go jump through portals to see each other. They were essentially in one world. They would have crossovers, so on and so forth. And during the Kamen Rider 4's O's/Double crossover film, it was revealed that the Kamen Riders from the Showa era existed in this world too. Which basically meant that this new Neo Heisei era is now tied back to the original world that was created during the Showa era. So now everything back on up has come back home, in a sense, to the original continuity, to the original universe of Kamen Rider. So that's basically how that goes. As a brief summary, Showa and Neo Heisei is linked. Heisei itself is mostly independent. And crossover films that have all of the franchises, all of the above, I say treat that in a case-by-case basis. Sometimes they try to insinuate it's all one world. Other times they have to use time-space shenanigans to get them all together, and so on and so forth. So treat that in a case-by-case basis. But in terms of TV series continuity, is exactly as I explained. Okay, the time has come to basically hammer out some general misconceptions there may be about Kamen Rider that I've seen, that I've heard before. The most specific one is Kamen Rider is not Japanese Power Rangers. I know. It's not. The Kamen Rider franchise itself existed before Super Sentai, which Power Rangers is the actual adaptation from. Again, Kamen Rider 71, Super Sentai 75, Power Rangers 90s. So, yeah. Power Rangers 90s. This is just the way it is. So, no. It's not Power Rangers in this. Kamen Rider itself has had crossovers with Super Sentai here and there, but most of the time, not so much, but they still exist separately. And crossover through, time-space portal shenanigan. Aesthetically, the difference I want to get into real fast between Kamen Rider and Super Sentai is Kamen Rider, aesthetically, they use body armor in some case. You've probably noticed it as I've been showing these pics as I've been going along. I guess it needed to be said. I figured I want to cover a little bit. Kamen Rider tends to opt for more body art style designs. Think more Iron Man, less Spider-Man. Is the best way I can explain it. Having one character stand next to each other, for one from Kamen Rider, one from Super Sentai, if you really look at it, you can tell which is which. And that's basically how it works. They have a more armor-based design. They have paddings of armor padding. Some have more elaborate paddings of chest plates. Some is like in the chest. Some it's more the whole thing is more armored. So that's, essentially the aesthetic difference. Also, Kamen Rider doesn't have any giant mecha or anything like that. They tend to focus on the individual battles on the ground. There's no giant mecha. There's none of that. And there's no monsters growing bigger, except for Jay, where he grows bigger in an Ultraman-y kind of way. But that's beside the point. So, okay. Another misconception that could happen is Kamen Rider is not a Japanese spin-off of Saban's Mask Rider. It is not a Japanese spin-off of the second attempt to adapt Kamen Rider Dragon Knight. Yes, I know they share the Kamen Rider name. I understand the word "kamen" in English is masked, but that doesn't mean anything. Those are just bad adaptations, just adaptations of Kamen Rider. And that's all that really needs to be said about that. Alright, that concludes this episode of Info Vids, where we covered Kamen Rider, what it is not, its continuity, its content, and things of that nature. And hopefully this was helpful to you. And if you feel like you want to share this video with others, go right ahead. I encourage it. If you felt this was helpful to you and you felt this would be helpful to other people who are trying to break into Kamen Rider, I guess if I could make any recommendations of where to start series-wise, I think my highest recommendation of the show to start with would probably be Double. For the most specific reason that it's just an amazing show. It's just a great show, and it has a little bit of everything. It has that comedy, it has that action, it has also has those scenes of seriousness, it also has the more mature themes and a little bit of violence. It has a bit of everything, and that's what kind of makes it, the point where every different type of Kamen Rider fan, whether they prefer the older stuff to the newer stuff or whatever, can kind of come together. And it's genuinely accepted as one of the best series they've ever made. And it's a great jumping point. It really is. And it puts you in line with all the Neo Heisei stuff and all the continuity going forward. The absolute worst series to start with is Decade. It's the worst to start with because it can be very confusing. And if you haven't seen the previous Heisei Riders, it gets double confusing when Blade shows up. And as a series, its ending's not very satisfying. I just pass that one. Just ignore it. Just pass on it. I know it has all those. I mean, you may think because it has all those Heisei Riders in it that it's the place to start. It's not. Don't. Like I mentioned, with the whole continuity segment of how they approach the whole AU stuff. It's confusing, and it's best to avoid. I don't recommend Den-O either as a starting point, because it might feed into some of those misconceptions about what the content of these shows really are. And I don't think it's a good starting point because of that reason. It's not a good reflection of how genuinely the type of storytelling that Kamen Rider normally has, and the level of maturity it tends to show at times. So that one doesn't really do a good job of that, so I would say don't start with it. That's the type of show that after you've gained a general liking of Kamen Rider, then you could probably dip into it. But if you just want to just ignore larger continuities and you just want a quick standoff 1, 2, 3 in and out show, there are plenty of the Heisei shows besides Den-O and besides Decade and besides Neo Heisei stuff. Faiz is great. Agito is great. Kyuga's pretty good. Blade's pretty good. Kabuto's just amazing to look at. It has some plot holes, but generally a good show, just with little plot holes. And so that's pretty much it. And hopefully this has been very helpful to you. This is your Tokusatsu tour guide, Exile 2K. Shout out on Facebook, and that's it. See you around.